Thank you all for coming this morning. I'm very pleased. We've got a full house on a Saturday morning. That's fantastic. My name is Rob Johnston. I'm the director of the George Perkins Marsh Institute here at Clark. I'm very pleased to introduce this session today. Many of you knew Roger Kasperson, some much better than I did. He passed away in 2021. Roger was a pioneer in the analysis, understanding, and communication of risk, a National Academy of Sciences member. I could spend half the session just reading off his accomplishments and accolades. One thing I do want to highlight, a number of those on the panel just completed a bibliographic memoir for Roger. That's through the National Academies, and that's available online. So you can just look that up. That's hot off the presses as of a few days ago, so we're very pleased to have that. But the reason we've gathered this panel here today is to discuss Roger's influence, the importance of his work, the lessons maybe that we can learn moving forward, and also maybe to share a few anecdotes about the person. I mean, Roger was wonderful, and so I've asked the panel, pretty much given them free rein to talk about whatever they would like. Some of it might be academic, some of it might be policy contributions, and others of it might just be stories we hadn't heard before. So, before I turn it loose to the panel, I'd like to give each of them a brief introduction. Again, with a panel like this, I could probably spend half the time just reading through their accomplishments. So, first, I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we'll go through. Dr. Kirstin is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of South Carolina and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She earned her Ph.D. here in geography from Clark in 1996 under Roger Kasperson's supervision. She is a social environmental geographer focusing on undertaking climate impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. She's been at the University of South Carolina since '96 with a 2-year leave of absence to serve as the director of the Poverty and Vulnerability Program at the Stockholm Environmental Institute, also while Roger was there. She currently serves as the co-chair of NOAA's Climate Working Group. Sam Ratick is Professor Emeritus here at Clark University. Sam, it's fantastic to see you back. He received his BA in Mathematics from SUNY Buffalo and his PhD in Geography and Environmental Engineering from Johns Hopkins. Dr. Ratick served as an environmental scientist with the US EPA very soon after the agency was formed. He also served as a legislative assistant for energy and environment to New York State Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He spent many years at Clark, where he's on the faculty of the Graduate School of Geography and Environmental Science and Policy Program at IDCE. He also served as the director of CENTED and then Marsh, and from a personal perspective, he was a fantastic mentor when I first arrived at Clark in 2008, helping me to understand how the university worked. Susan Hanson is also a professor emeritus at Clark. She's an urban geographer working in areas such as gender and economy, transportation, local labor markets, and sustainability. Susan was director of the Graduate School of Geography for 9 of her over 25 years here at Clark. She was editor of several academic journals, including the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, Urban Geography, and Economic Geography, and was the geography editor of the International Encyclopedia of the Social and Behavioral Sciences. She's past president of the Association of American Geographers, AAG, and an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Welcome.
Now I'm very old.
I told you we could go on for a long time here. And last but not least, Billie Lee Turner is Regents Professor and Gilbert White Professor of Environment and Society of the Environment and Society School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning and School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. Say that a few times fast. He was a member of the Graduate School of Geography for 28 years, from 1980 to 2008, and served as director for the Graduate School of Geography for various different periods covering 10 years. He was also the founding director of the Marsh Institute for 3 years. He pursues human environment science across subjects ranging from prehistory to contemporary climate change and sustainability. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences and has served as associate editor of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS, since 2012. So, with that, even before we start, could we please welcome our panel? With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. Each of them I've asked to spend about 10 minutes saying whatever they would like, and then we're going to open the floor for anything you all would like to say. Questions, answers, comments, anything. So, thanks very much. Kirstin.
Is this, can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you all. It's really a pleasure and honor to be one of the panel and join my colleagues that I've known, mentors and colleagues I've known for so long, talk about someone who made such a difference in my life. Boy, I thought I was going to get through this without just a little choking up. But okay, but I got it, because there's some really interesting, really impactful stories to tell. When I was thinking about it and reviewing it with graduate student colleagues of mine, I talked to one of my graduate student colleagues, and she said, "I'm from California, Kirstin. The most authentic thing you might do is shed a tear." So here we go. Thank you. If any of you remember Doreen Mattingly, she's doing well. She's a working artist. All right. But so when I thought about this, I thought really one of the things, most important things I learned from Roger as a mentor and just as a role model in scholarship was how he went about developing questions and choosing what he was going to focus on. And there was a book that came out in '96 from the National Academies entitled Understanding Risk, Informing Decisions in a Democratic Society. I thought, you know, that really is a nice way of encapsulating what the goal of much of his work was. How do we find a place in this conversation to bring science to bear on practice and have practice-informed science for the betterment of society? I forgot the name of the woman yesterday who talked about care as an important part of geography and saw that in Roger's work as well as Bob Cates. So, you know, we think about that. One of Roger's earliest publications was about confronting equity in radioactive waste management. And he worked on questions of disparities between occupational and other exposures with Dominic Golding, who I'm delighted to see here today. Also took on questions like the social amplification of risk. Now this was back in the late 80s when the conversation about which risks we should do were really important. The EPA had just published a report that probably you haven't forgotten, you've forgotten, or maybe you've never even met or came across, called Worst Things First. And it was a federal agency saying we think that the priorities that are being pursued under the legislative mandates that we've established in Congress are not the right ones. We think that maybe if we were to do the math about how many people died and mortalities and cost-benefit analysis, we might come up with a whole other set of priorities. And it was such an interesting moment, like, is that the rational way to do it? But the contribution to this conversation was, let's start to think about some other dimensions of what might make a fair and equitable outcome, right? That's one way of thinking about what's worst. But let's think about the distributional impacts. Let's think about the fairness. Let's consider procedural and distributional equity in a number of different dimensions. And Roger did that, and the social amplification of risk became part of a number of pieces which focused on how does society actually pick the risks we care about the most? What are the dimensions of it? Who's the influential voice? How does that happen? And led us to really systematically examine where those decisions were coming from and maybe where we could come into it. So thinking about what the questions were and how you could inform debates in society was important. Now, once you had a focus, of course, you didn't just like go, not Roger anyway. The important thing to do was to, step number one, the Kasperson, collect kindred spirits. and he's found a number of wonderful people. Seth Tuller was here, said, Roger had this way of dropping little tidbits of interesting research topics in front of people to see who would grab on it, you know? And then sort of bring those people into the fold. And he grabbed people from all over the place, sociologists, psychologists, economists, philosophers, I worked with him, when I arrived, I worked with him just in time to see the beginning of Regions at Risk in the Global Environmental Change book. Now, Regions at Risk, and Sam is here, he's the one who, this is a story about Sam's insights a little bit. So the Regions at Risk was an ambitious, you might say audacious proposal. This is a comparative international case study of places that people thought were about to no longer be habitable and sustainable in any way. Nepal, the mountains there, the forests of Indonesia, the high plains of Texas, Mexico City, the North Sea, the Aral Sea, which was declining, the eroding plateaus of China, the highlands of Amazonia and highlands of Kenya, and then Amazonia, these all over the world. And he collected scholars who were experts in each of these places, including colleagues Diane Rocheleau, I don't know if Jody Emmel's here, but all of these people, all experts who could tell the stories of these really important places. And they were writing the NSF proposal, and I sit in the back of the room as a graduate student, and they're like, well, this is pretty, we know this is, we're asking quite a bit here, and we're claiming quite a bit. And somebody said, well, actually, we might as well just say, we think that we got the team who can do it. And that was in this one, and Billie were very much a part of bringing together that amazing team. And of course, for graduate students, you start mentoring at that stage, and then that mentoring continues for a lifetime throughout the stages of your career. And I should just say, is with these kindred spirits, what you needed to do once you had them is you had to have either the small Sented meetings where you regularly work to refine the questions with different perspectives, or you'd have these workshops followed by raucous dinners, and usually some dancing, and you'd go from a broad topic to a much more refined focus, and it was a wonderful process that built community around them. Now, once you had your kindred spirits, of course, you can't stop there. What you need to do, the next ingredient, is to bring out this big, broad impact on scientific agendas. And for that, you need to think about something like working with Bill Turner and Bob Cates and others. Yesterday, we heard about the human dimensions wiring diagrams, and they had these nice little feedback diagrams that you've all seen that sort of mark the biogeochemical cycles. You're like, and all of them in their different ways saying, by the way, what are the causes of those changes? And where are the consequences? And let's talk about the human dimensions of this. And made a forceful, compelling argument that really changed the face of that entire research agenda. Before those documents appeared, they were well at work, and the documents reflected their efforts in shaping those things. It was really, it was really amazing to see that. Roger also did this with the Society for Risk Analysis. Risk analysis could have been about toxicologists and engineers deciding, load-bearing weights and thinking about dose-response curves. But with Roger's, continued investment, and with his cohort of kindred spirits, Paul Slovic, Nick Pidgeon, Eugene Rosa, it became a much more diverse conversation that really recognized the social dimensions of it. When we think about risks and we say, it's just, there's one thing to say it's an equal risk, but some risks aren't fair. And some risks are voluntary, and some aren't. And some of them are just plain, I think a really good distinction Roger made in one of his papers was that we talked about what's an acceptable risk, but actually often we don't get to accept it. Nobody actually asked me if I thought it was, but they'll sort of do it, and I'm supposed to see if I'll tolerate it. But making that distinction between what was acceptable and what was tolerable, and how that worked in societal dialogues was an important part of that agenda. Now he did this for the formation of the Society of Risk Analysis, and then on numerous science advisory boards, the EPA, the Academy committees, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments. And then, as a good graduate student, of course, you observe your advisor and you watch how they do this, right? And Roger would sit and he'd often listen. He'd listen, and he'd not really jump in immediately. But you could see him sort of thinking it in, and he'd give it some time, and then he'd say, well, I think I've seen these themes and these questions, and he would just make this synthetic statement that brought together nuggets and compelling pieces of what everyone in the room had said. And it was amazing to watch, just this synthesis that would shift in a whole conversation. But sometimes, and not infrequently, he would identify a hard central question. And he'd say, oh, this has not, we need to think about this. And he'd tell the story. One of the only times I'd heard Roger be intimidated was he said, I'm going to run some new ideas past Gilbert White. And those of you who aren't hazards geographers, Gilbert White founded the field of hazards geography, a brilliant man with these piercing blue eyes. And Roger would say, I remember those piercing eyes. He says, I know I'm going to tell Gilbert, and he's going to take a minute, and then he's going to say, oh, but Roger, have you thought about this? He's like, oh, no. So Roger was both, sort of intimidated, prepared for that. And I think he honed that skill pretty well himself over time. Always doing that. Another funny thing about him, though, is that while he would often sit and listen, he would have a pen in his hand. And while I was working with him at the Stockholm Environment Institute, his business manager and I noticed that he would sit and listen. But if he was getting aggravated, that pen would go faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. We took him aside and said, Roger, you can't play poker with a pen in your hand. That's just not going to fly. All right. So just in conclusion, one of the thing about the hard questions Roger also really taught was about not shirking from the hard questions for others or for yourself, or for the ones that just don't seem tractable to research. One of the major projects we did, he and Susie Moser put together a gathering of his kindred spirits and his graduate students, and on the beautiful eastern shore of Maryland, followed by dancing and awesome food. But the focus of it wasn't the work that he'd done as he'd moved to retirement, but what he thought the agenda needed to be going forward. In the book, Risk Conundrums includes contributions. Like, yeah, the conundrums. What are the really hard ones? It's a fabulous book if you can see it, but the advice that he gave to all of us in contributing, and I think probably there's many, many authors here, was to be provocative. Don't just step back from that argument. Put it forward. Let's get this conversation going. Let's keep this dialogue going, and not stay in the safe zone, but see what we can do to advance this conversation. And the same with his recent edited journal special issue on the social amplification of risk. Sort of a conceptual wiring diagram that looked at the contributions from multiple disciplines and encouraged us all to gauge with that how it is that we're picking risks and how we're thinking about them and how we evaluate, how they're evaluated by society and what that means for us. And we spent quite a bit of time just reflecting, reconsidering, and developing another round of what's next in that. What's next in that agenda? I think that's one of the great lessons I learned is that these going back and revisiting and continuing that exploration and finding more ways to respond to changes in society and advances in science is a sort of an ongoing journey for scholarship and a real model for me. So thank you all for letting me share that.
Oh, and the reason is,
Pull the mic.
yeah, I'll pull the mic closer. Next time I want to go first. I don't want to follow Kirstin, but it's wonderful. And it's great to be here, and as I've been telling the people as we met, that Roger really is responsible for my being at Clark and being able to stay at Clark and having a career here. So it's difficult to do this without tearing up, but I'll try. And I have a...
I set the precedent, all right.
I have a brief story that I hope provides an example of how Roger's influence transcended his prolific academics and influenced both the development and implementation of effective public policy, much along the lines of what Kirstin just talked about. But early in my time at Clark, I invited Jack White, who was then president of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, whom I knew when I was working in Washington, to come to Clark to meet with researchers at the Center for Technology, Environment, and Development, which Roger helped co-found, and to give a talk. At those times, talks at CENTED were, if a if someone was around who had something interesting to say, you brought them in, they gave us a very brief presentation. It was just in the CENTED conference room, and then you had all sorts of interactions with those people. It was wonderful. Prior to Jack's talk, when he came here, I took him over to the Kasperson Library for a tour. And Gene Kasperson gave him a tour, and Gene was fantastic at that stuff, and showed him around. And then we came into a room, one wall of which was dedicated to the risks associated with high-level radioactive waste disposal. Because Roger at that time was heading up a project on the Yucca Mountain high-level radioactive waste disposal facility. And Jack was just really, really impressed. And I didn't know exactly why. You know, we saw all sorts of stuff in the CENTED library. The gray literature was kind of not published, but somehow we'd be able to get it, and it really helped. And then in his talk with CENTED, Jack started to say that they were having trouble concerning the siting of a low-level radioactive waste facility in New York. At which time states were allowed to form compacts or go it alone, and New York State decided to go it alone. A siting commission had been formed with scientists, laypersons, former politicians, and the NYSERDA was to team with the siting commission to open an office to provide material for the public about the low-level radioactive waste repository, which NYSERDA then was to build. The siting commission did a really good job in technical analysis, and when they were done, they had chosen about five sites in rural New York where you could have a low-level radioactive waste repository, and they decided to put it into the paper that those 5 sites were chosen on Christmas. Now, the reason that they did that was because they thought that this would be a Christmas present to one of those sites to host this facility, because it's, you know, you can have people there, you're going to have all sorts of activity and stuff. Jack mentioned that the siting commission's only problem was to fend off the anger of the communities that were sent home without a facility. It was obvious that the siting commission had not heeded Roger's work on the adverse response of a host community chosen to host the noxious facility. As he noted in his publications, this is a sense of inequity that accompanies such a singular designation, and by the violation of a fundamental principle of equity that arises when one group is compelled to bear a disproportionate fraction of the risks for the benefit of a regional population, very similar to what Kirstin was talking about. And that, of course, was his parts of many of his talks, many of the things he was writing at the time and such. And about that time, that's when Jack visited CENTED, so that, you know, NYSERDA was kind of involved in this thing, and he came in and started to talk. Jack was not only impressed with CENTED's academic scope of the issues surrounding the radioactive waste disposal, but also the manner in which Roger was able to understand the problems facing NYSERDA, which was an agency, a research agency, to identify and organize relevant, important issues in a very collegial manner, propose some ways to address those issues. So Jack, being so very impressed, said, would Roger come to Albany to meet with some of his staff and members of the siting commission to help us and them learn more about the issues facing New York State and NYSERDA concerning the problem. In the first meeting, we were brought over to the siting commission's headquarters. Roger and I went together to Albany. In the first meeting, we were brought over to the siting commission headquarters, and we came up to the front door, which would be big double doors, and there were chains around the handles. You couldn't open the doors. Why? Because they were afraid of people from those communities that they had chosen coming up and giving them some sort of trouble. I use a term that Roger and I did it together, but Roger really was the person in charge of this. I just sort of happened to come along. And in our meeting with Jack, he told Roger that NYSERDA was to join with the Siting Commission and together open up a public information office regarding the siting of low-level radioactive waste. And then he asked what we thought about it. And as Kirstin mentioned, Roger would sit and ponder and think really hard about something. And I knew he was going to come up with some really good academic reason why, we shouldn't do this. And what he said to Jack was, I wouldn't partner with them if they held a gun to my head. Yeah. Jack kind of looked at him, and I kind of looked at him, and then Jack said, well, I have to go to a meeting, but let's discuss this further when we meet at lunch. And we said fine, and so Roger and I had another meeting, and then we went to lunch, and Jack was sitting at the table at lunch, chairs for us, and he looked up at Roger and he said, okay, now tell me how to do that. So, right? This is the head of an agency in New York State, a really important agency, is saying, okay, Roger, now how do I do that? So our conversation at lunch was Roger discussing with him, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Pretty much got that from here. And he said, so then he says, okay, we don't do that. We're going to do something else. Remember now, this is only, Roger has met with Jack White, the president of NYSERDA, only twice. And after that time, Jack said, gee, can you and the people at Cented please help us? And I think, now we were talking about the mid-1980s, we got something in the neighborhood of $100,000 to $200,000, $150,000 to $200,000 to help them do this, help them cope with this notion of the Siting Commission really blew it and the agency is in trouble, and can we do something about that? And the idea was we were going to do all sorts of things, help the staff understand. Roger was heading this up, and to hold some seminars and assemblies on the public participation and public reactions to the siting of hazardous facilities and radioactive waste facilities. It was pretty amazing to me, as you said, to watch Roger run these assemblies and these seminars. I mean, they had very important people from the state come to these things, and local people, and everybody was coming in. Roger sort of found just the right tone to ask the questions. Things went well. So it was very, 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 very impressive. But then what happened was New York State then decided that NYSERDA had best discuss what they're going to do with the low-level radioactive waste they already had and cited. And so he said to, he was talking to Roger, and he said, we have to put out all these plans for what we plan to do with the radioactive waste that's currently at the site and how we're going to go forward with all this. And he said, and so Roger said, when you do this, do you ask for public comment on your proposals? He said, oh yeah, we have to. We're a public agency. We put this out. And Roger said, what do you do with those comments? And Jack said, well, when we publish something, when we publish our final decisions, we put all the comments, pro and con, in there. He said, Roger said, yeah. He said, but I wonder, do you think it would really help if you responded to those reasonable comments? And Jack looks at him because this is a big state and this is a big issue, and there's an awful lot of comments that come in. And Jack said, well, tell us how to do that. How do you expect that? And once again, Roger, using the way he thought about it, he said, well, we'll all help. So for a few months, we were all involved in answering comments on those particular proposals from New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Jack had probably most of his staff working on it. We had a lot of people incented. I don't know if you were there at the time, but what's a reasonable comment? And Roger was running the whole thing, and here's a chance for us to take things that we academically have developed and see if we can really make them work with public participation and such. By the way, one of those facilities was in Manhattan. Yeah. But what happened was it did a great job. The public response was fantastic. They were, we get our comments that go, well, I may disagree with what the agency wants to do and this way or that way, but I very much respect that you took my opinion and considered it in when you were developing your material. And so it greatly, once again, Jack was extremely pleased with the results and lavished much praise on Roger and his CENTED team. And just a little side effect, because it goes along with what Kirstin said, this is about the time that the social amplification of risk paper was being developed. So all this kind of had a chance, and I think my time is up. All right, just one more, let me just read one thing to you, because when I mentioned it to Rob, he said, well, maybe you can sort of tie it off in one way, and I just have one little paragraph to read, if you don't mind. As I believe the story illustrates, Roger, in the manner in which he helped create CENTED Marsh, and in the application of his scholarship, and the manner in which he interacted with others, created a community and a culture where all responsible voices were heard, respected, and woven into the fabric of the multidisciplinary environment he created at Clark. I believe it was Roger's open, friendly, and accepting personality and his sincere wish to find the best resolutions to difficult problems that made the ways in which he applied his exceptional academic scholarship to address important and difficult public policy issues so fruitful in producing effective solutions. Thanks.
I think it's really fitting and great that we're having this remembrance of Roger's contributions as part of the 100th celebration of the GSG and Clark, because Roger and Clark were inseparable. It would be much easier for me to talk about the small amounts of time when Roger wasn't at Clark over his lifetime than to do what I'm going to do, which is to focus, I want to focus my comments on his contributions to Clark. Most of you know I am not a guru in risk hazards. That's not my expertise. But I did work closely with Roger over more than 25 years while we were on the faculty together. And I want to tell you a little bit about what his contributions were to our department and the university. But first, a little bit of history. Roger grew up, he was a local boy. He grew up in Northborough on a farm. This was well before Northborough was completely transformed by two major transportation, transportation routes, I-190 and I-290, which intersect very close to Northborough, and transformed that town from a farming community into a suburban one, and it's still growing very rapidly, I understand, from one of our experts who mentioned it yesterday. So he came to Clark in 1955 on a scholarship. He was an incredible athlete. None of us seem to know what sport he got his scholarship for. Was it basketball? But I think basketball. Okay, basketball. He was a basketball. athlete, and he came to Clark on a athletic scholarship, and I was very jealous of that because I had a scholarship to go to Middlebury, but it wasn't an athletic one. Anyway, one of the key accomplishments of his undergraduate years at Clark was that he met Jean, and he graduated cum laude in 1959. And now I'm going to throw a bunch of titles and dates at you, but for a reason, okay? He did leave Clark to go to graduate school and get a Ph.D. in geography from the University of Chicago, which he got in 1966. He returned to Clark in '68 after 2 short-term appointments elsewhere. He returned to Clark as an assistant professor of geography and government. And that's important, I think, especially given some of the things we've already heard about. He was promoted to an associate, so he comes in '68, he's promoted to associate in '69, yeah, and full professor in '75. And then he was university professor from '97 to 2000, and then in 2000 he became research professor and distinguished scientist at the Marsh Institute. And emeritus, officially he became an emeritus professor in the GSG, not government, in 2004. So that's a really quick trip through his academic career, which is his career of teaching and research, which fortunately we have 3 knowledgeable people here to tell us about, and we've already heard a lot about his academic accomplishments. But a couple of things to notice about this list of titles and dates. He certainly didn't languish in the junior roles in the faculty at all. And it was really through his activities in the professorial ranks that he made his contributions to the discipline. And really, the fancy titles that he received toward the end of his career reflects his many contributions to the field of geography and risk hazards. What's remarkable to me is that with all he accomplished as a teacher and researcher, he also managed to contribute a great deal to Clark and to our department as an academic leader through various administrative roles that he played at Clark that were very important. So in chronological order, these include, from '71 to '74, he was dean of the college. Do we still have that title? Yes, okay. And this is the top person who's in charge of the undergraduate academic activities at Clark. This is a full-time job, all right? So he did that from '71 to '74, before he became a full professor. He was one of the founders, along with Bob Cates and Chris Hohenhemser, of the Center for Technology, Environment, and Development, fondly known as CENTED, which was housed over in this area in the old girls' gym. And he led CENTED from '78 to '81, and then again from '87 to '90, at which point CENTED morphed into the Marsh Institute. And he was also instrumental in setting up that morph. CENTED was a research institute, I think everybody knows this, which focused on human environment and, of course, technology intertwinements, and especially risk hazards. And having this research center and the accompanying library resources, which Jean was in charge of, really put Clark on the map in this bundle of research, in this area of research. It really put Clark on the map, and which, of course, has continued with the Marsh Institute. Now, from 93 to 97, he was provost and VP for academic affairs, which is the chief academic officer running the entire academic show at Clark. I mean, the provost is a major. Again, it's a full-time job. It is more than a full-time job. But in none of these positions was Roger a placeholder. His goal was to make Clark a better place for students and for faculty. And he was a leader. He, for example, as provost, he very actively involved all the academic departments in strategic planning. Now, we had developed strategic plans before then, but Roger made sure that we were revisiting our strategic plans at least once a year, and we were acting on those strategic plans in a way that would really move things forward and not just keep us running on a treadmill. So he wanted to make sure that every department was reviewing their strategic plan routinely and acting on it and making sure that it meshed with the university's strategic plan. You can see some themes here in the way Roger thought, I think. So as provost, he didn't always tell you what you'd want to hear, and I can vouch for that, but he was always impeccably honest, and he was compassionate. He was a very kind person. And I want to give you just one personal example of that. So it was during one of those years when I was director, I got a national fellowship that would require me to take it the next academic year, and I was supposed to still be director, and Roger said, "I'll do that for you. I'll be acting director." I mean, I was just flabbergasted, and he was acting, so we can add that to his list of leadership roles within the university. He was acting director of geography for a year, as a kindness to me. So you see the bottom line here, the common thread in all of these academic leadership roles that he played, it was really to move things forward and make sure Clark was a better place. Obviously, all these roles took him away from his research in particular, but it didn't seem to put a dent at all in his accomplishments. So now for a couple of stories. My first academic encounter with Roger was entirely on paper. I had never met Roger. I was in my first job at SUNY Buffalo at the time. And it was really courtesy of a little project that the AAG, the American Association of Geographers, had at the time. There was a Commission on College Geography, and they were producing these little booklets, each targeted on a different subject and aimed at undergraduates. So they were just fantastic for undergraduate teaching, and I used a lot of them in my courses over the years. One of them was authored by, is Myrna here? She was here yesterday. Anyway, Roger, along with Myrna Breitbart, wrote one of these little pamphlets aimed at undergraduates. The topic was community participation and advocacy planning. Remember, Roger was a professor of geography and government. And this was really aimed at, well, first of all, advocacy planning was a very hot topic in the early 1970s. This is for urban planning. So here they are. They're not talking about risk hazards. They're talking about urban planning. And how do we involve community members in planning, in the planning process? This is ringing bells with what you were talking about, Sam. because this was I'll tell you the punchline first, because I used a lot of these over the years, and this was the most brilliant one of them all. It was just incredibly thought-provoking and timely. So they shed light on the multiplicity of interests in any one community. And they raised questions about whose interests were at stake in a given plan and in what way. So advocacy planners were supposed to be advocating on behalf of members of the community. But Roger and Myrna were raising questions about, well, whose interests are you advocating for? And do they really reflect the diversity, the multiplicity of views in a given community? And they had suggestions for how planners might go about ensuring that they engage with a representative range of community interests. So that was my first academic encounter with Roger many, many years before. That came out in '74, I think. Came out well before I ever met Roger. But the last, my last vignette, my last vignette is called Adventures in China with Roger and Billie. Because in the summer of 1990, the IGU, the International Geographical Union, held its big global meeting in Beijing. And so Roger wanted to use this time to do some field work on the Ordos Plateau, which would feed into this Regions at Risk book. Because the Ordos Plateau, I'm going to use, this is for the physical geographers here, the Loess Plateau of China. That's a secret word that only geographers know. Loess, L-O-E-S-S.
Just for your attention, please.
So we were in a Land Rover with a Chinese student, thank heavens, because we didn't speak Chinese. And the goal was to interview farmers, and basically subsistence farmers. Now, the sampling was it was not science. It was kind of a random drive around the Ordos Plateau, and over there's a farm, let's go talk to the farmer. But watching Roger in action, gathering data, really interested in how climate change, first of all, were farmers aware of climate change, and if so, how, and then gather data on how it had affected their farming, their well-being, how it had affected their food supply, how long it had been going on, what they recognized, what they didn't, and all of that. It was very, very interesting to watch him in action in a very casual way, collecting data. At the same time, I want to close on this, this note, which is Roger had a fantastic sense of humor. And so he and Billie decided that to humor themselves, they would pick on me. I was a vegetarian, and so Roger took great delight in calling me a rabbit because all I would eat is carrots and celery sticks. And then I don't know where they got this idea, but they said I should really, because we were in China, they wanted to buy me this sheath, dress with a slit up the side that went up to, and then, and then they were laughing hysterically because they knew I would never wear anything like that. But it came up very often. It's obviously still in my somewhat demented memory that they were fixated on getting me this very slinky dress with, a slit up the side. Well, maybe up two sides, I don't know. But Roger had a wonderful sense of humor, and it was fun to go along with it.
Actually, I thought I had a picture of that dress. But
No slide.
I just want to point out that I wasn't really the founding director of the Marsh Institute. I just happened to be the director when the name changed from Cented to Marsh. And the only reason I was director is because Roger decided to go to Sweden for a couple of years and be a director of another institute. Okay, so I'm going to launch in a different way. When I came to Clark, I'd never heard of the risk hazard community. And when I saw what it was engaged in, I assessed that these were approaches of using case studies, conceptual thematic work, and all of it to draw practical lessons from. And while the risk hazard community at that time was certainly influenced by the alternative approaches that were present in the Graduate School of Geography, it operated in mainstream science, or post-positivism. Despite that, the risk hazard community at Clark never really tested claims, at least quantitatively. I can't recall of any work, but you guys tell me if you did, that, for instance, took cultural theory, or VPN, that's the values, behavior, norm theory, and tested it against responses of vulnerability, or responses in risk assessment, right? None of this is meant to be a criticism, but rather to put the context of risk hazard as it was practiced at Cented and then ultimately at Marsh at that particular time. Deeply involved in the development of frameworks, deeply involved in case studies and comparative case studies, and at times developing skeletons of explanations, right? A set of variables that one might think through could create an explanation in a theoretical sense. I set that up because my first really in-depth experience as a researcher with Roger, not as a director of geography and talking to the provost, which he was very kind to me too, was just as the risk hazard community at Clark began to move into sustainability science. Now, that wasn't driven by Roger, that was really driven by Robert, the great visionary Robert Cates, who used the National Academy of Sciences as a mechanism to develop sustainability science. But Roger and Jean were both part of a deep conversation that went on with Bob Cates. Bob Cates had just left Clark at the time, over what sustainability science could be, how one could approach it, and whatnot. And for Roger and Jean, this developed through the Cented, before it became Marsh, as inserting risk hazard research into sustainability science. And that's where my link with Roger as a researcher became involved, because we were able, through a larger group of people, to create something called the Vulnerability Assessment for Sustainability Science, or VASS, V-A-S-S, if you like acronyms. So VASS was published in 2003 in the Proceedings of the National Academy, and no, I wasn't the associate director then, so there's no cheating on the getting it published. What it did, VASS did, was attempt to take the risk hazard assessment of assessments with the PAR model, pressure and release model, that had come out of the critical theory group, and to insert that into a means by which to address sustainability. Now, what the VASS framework did was create, if you would, an ideal framing of vulnerability for coupled systems. Coupled systems are social, environmental, or social ecological systems, and they constitute the bedrock entity that sustainability sciences address. Right? They don't just address the social, they don't just address the environmental, it's the interaction between the two. Well, that framework that Roger was deeply involved in helping develop has become the most cited of all vulnerability assessments for sustainability. And my eyeballing it just before I came to the meeting, I believe it's Roger's most cited, well, it's not just Roger, but Roger et al.'s most cited work that Roger undertook towards the ending of his career. What this assessment did is it recognized that vulnerability was not just a product of the social system, but of the environmental system as well. And that vulnerability, risk hazard, and the PAR model were not accounting for the environmental subsystem in their assessment. So the whole notion was that you had to account for that, and that you had to account for the interactions between the environmental and the social subsystems if you wanted to understand the truly coupled system. Also, because it was part of sustainability science, which is deeply embedded in systems, it had everything to do with system dynamics, cross-scale dynamics, lag effects, and all the words that you hear about how complex systems can be undertaken. There's a new work that just came out this spring in JAMBA, which is a risk hazard journal, International Risk Hazard Journal, a bibliometric assessment of that work on VAS. And what it shows is it may be the most cited of all frameworks dealing with vulnerability, dealing with sustainability science. But it also shows that much of that notation to it is lip service, meaning that the actual work undertaken doesn't really engage the full VAS framework. Right? Why would this be if it's being cited as what's undertaken? Well, I would suggest there's two reasons. First is that the vulnerability community at large is really interested in the social subsystem, not the environmental one. And secondly, VAS is so complex, it's simply too difficult, really, to undertake. A former Stanford student named Amy Lures undertook a quantitative attempt at VAS, and it was for a irrigation system in Mexico. And anyway, her conclusion was, you just can't do it. And you can't do it because the data requirements are just too many, and the interactions are simply just too many. And so she didn't conclude, but I conclude that from her work, we see that VAS is sort of like the concept of inclusive wealth. Does anyone in the room ever heard of inclusive wealth? Yeah, I never raise my hand when someone says, please raise your hand. Inclusive wealth is the metric by which sustainable development is addressed. Right? So it's the economics way of dealing with everything that you have to deal with to reach sustainable development. Well, if you look at that concept, it too is so complex and so data rich that you really can't use it. Well, I shouldn't say you can't use it, but the point that Amy was trying to point out to all of us, and that inclusive wealth does as well, is that you can only address this complexity in a piecemeal way, and that you need to focus on only a few variables, right, to really grapple with the situation, or we create a dashboard of measures, right, that we use. Now, I've been talking about the academics of VAS. Let me come back to Roger and VAS. That framework was developed in the classic Roger way that we've heard on this side of the table. It was bringing an interesting group of people together, creating a dialogue, going through this and that and this and that. And Roger, while not necessarily the lead, was certainly the spokesperson in the room that was constantly bringing people back together again to think through this or to think through that. And Gene was always in the background writing notes and passing them over to Roger. Right? Yeah. So they were wonderful in this particular development, and I must say it was one of the most enjoyable research activities that I undertook. I'm done.
So, thank you so much. That was amazing. So we have about 10 minutes or a few minutes more if we want to stretch it for any comments, questions, feedback, thoughts, recollections.
Stories.
I'll give you one. If no one's going to ask you a question. So, if you don't know, I used to be quite argumentative. With age, I've become quite mellow. I just don't care when people tell me I'm wrong. I was teaching, it was about the second or third year I was teaching, and you know the Clark graduate students, they can be quite argumentative. So I had a class of a bunch of graduate students, and I can't remember what the class was on, but what I remember is one student, typical Clark, I don't understand why I came here. You claim that you're good in risk and hazard, and I can't find a course in risk hazard. You know, just complaining, and I looked at her and I said, well, why did you come here? You know, in a very sarcastic way. 2 days later, I'm standing in the hall, and Roger comes up to me and says, I hear you're telling students they shouldn't come here because... And that created a little argument in the hall, but I just raised it. I just remember that so distinctly, that I was trying to tell a student one thing, and she went and told Roger something very different.
We do remember the great stories of Roger juggling all these things. You know, you hear Susan tell, yeah, he did it, but it was complicated. And Sammy might tell the great, you know, one of the great, back when the Atwood lecture had a little bit of a roast. And it's, there was a moment where...
Where's Roger?
The Where's Roger piece.
Yeah, students,
Oh, yeah. I mean,
students would
yes.
film us in the hallways.
Really good.
Yes.
And ask all the press, where's Roger? You know, where,
Yeah, it's sort of a Where's Waldo, but there would be you
Right,
with this
right.
big thing. Maybe he's here. What day is it?
I'll actually pop in a little thing that occurred to me as someone who only knew Roger, you know, later in his life. One of the things that always impressed me was just how human and humble he was. So, you know, I came in 2008, and, you know, and Roger Kasperson, I mean, it's a huge, you know, huge kind of personality, huge impact. And he would constantly, I mean, he was a senior research scientist. He wasn't at Clark at the time, but was still, you know, working on you know, various books, chapters, articles through us. And Luann Pisanka at the Marsh Institute would help him edit things, and we would help him put things online. And we would often come in during his visits to Worcester and sit down and ask if he could come and talk with me as director. And I was, of course, come on. And he was always amazingly gracious about the little bit of help that we would provide to him. And he was always apologizing for the fact that, you know, that he needed editorial help, and was always asking if it was okay, would ask my permission if he could work with Luann to help edit his chapter. And that always stuck with me, right? That you have someone who's on the National Academies, has made such profound contributions, such a long legacy at Clark. And of course we're going to help him edit his chapter. Of course we're going to help him put something on the web. It was just a few hours here and there. But the fact that he always asked, and that he didn't ask in a demanding way, and I feel if we had said no, he would have said fine. But that really stuck with me, that you have someone that has that profound of an impact, and at the same time brings such humanity and humility to the role.
I want to follow up on that. My name is Ellen Hughes-Cromwick, and I was a Ph.D. student here in economics, but I started with the International Development Program, and we were so fortunate as grad students to have space in CENTED. And on a personal note, walking into the building, and, you know, of course, Roger's office was right there as you went up the stairs. He was so open. Susan, I'm so glad you talked about his bigger sphere here at Clark, because he was extremely motivational to all of us, even though I was in economics and, kind of off the path of geography. And I remember, being pregnant with my daughter Carrie here. And, back in those days, you were pregnant, you're a grad student, where are you gonna go? Your path was somewhat, in some sense, truncated. People felt like, you weren't really serious. And not for Roger. Roger was so motivational, and he knew we had as much capacity as anybody else. Touching story.
My name is Sharon Krefetz, and I came to Clark in 1973 to teach one course on urban politics. I was still a graduate student working on my Ph.D. in politics at Brandeis, and the reason that I was hired to teach one course on urban politics was because Roger Kasperson had become dean of the college, and as somebody commented before, he did have an appointment here as both a faculty member in the geography school department and what was then called the Government and International Relations department. And I remember him interviewing me and asking me, about some things about what I thought I would like to include in the course. And he just listened and listened and listened, and then made me feel so confident because he said, "That's just great. I mean, I thought he was going to give me suggestions, recommendations. He said, you have this just down the way it should be, and your students are really going to appreciate learning from you." About 20 years later, in 1993, I had become dean of the college, and Roger became provost, as was mentioned, and vice president for academic affairs. And I then had the opportunity to work really closely with him. And what I think impressed me, again, the most about him was his listening. He really, really listened. And it wasn't just, a facade of, sitting and, kind of nodding his head. He really listened and he responded. And I think one of the major contributions that he made, which most people are unaware of, is that for the first time in modern Clark history, he did create an academic and financial plan, a 10-year plan, that every department had to contribute to, have their own plan. And he actually then checked to see how people were doing, including us in the administration. But again, I just have to say it, his listening and his showing real concern and caring about everybody was just amazing to me, and I felt really, really privileged to have him as a mentor and as a colleague and a friend. And he and Jean became very good friends of my husband and me. And again, we just have such fond memories of our times with them outside of Clark, outside the classroom at their home, and meeting places for dinner. So that's my take on Roger.
And with that, I just
want to mention, if any of you are planning on going on the field trip, then you need to move on because the bus is leaving in about 52 minutes. And so, if you did sign up to go on the field trip to the Arboretum, I would say now is the time to just kind of mosey off through the door, but like a speedy mosey, and then sit here.
all right, okay. Yeah.
Dominic.
Oh,
Dominic.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I'm Dominic Golding. I was a grad student with Roger back in the 80s. You could go on for hours about stories about Roger and his amazing abilities to do this and that and so forth. There's two comments I'd like to make. One is, we should have a picture of Roger up there with his feet on the table, wearing his desert boots, and with his fisherman's cap on, Greek fisherman's hat. Okay. The other thing is, since Billie's here, I'll take the opportunity to give him a hard time. I've got to get payback for when he was on my committee. Right? At my defence, Billie says to me, I was working on vulnerability issues, so this is in the workplace. So this is some of the early work that Roger was doing on vulnerability and such. And Billie said to me, "Is this geography?" And so as a testament to how Roger can bring people together and shift them across the spectrum, it's just it's just wonderful to see Billie later on then working in issues of vulnerability and sustainability. Thank you.
Maybe one more, and then we'll call it. Anyone? Who wants to? All right, well.
Oh, is it me or is it somebody else?
All right, go for it.
Thank you. My name is Mariana Pavlovskaya, and I came to Clark University in 1990 with Elena, who is right there. Based upon my accent, you may be wondering, but we came from the former Soviet Union that actually existed at the time. And I just want to say that Roger played a very important role in it, because several people here mentioned critical environmental zones project. So one of them was the Aral Sea. And Roger and Billie and Timothy Ariordan, right? They came to Moscow, to the Institute of Geography, to discuss exactly this kind of issue. Right, Helena? And I just wanted to say that meeting Roger totally transformed my image of an academic, because he came to the research meetings, as Dominique now was describing, in a t-shirt, in shorts, in a fisherman hat. And for somebody from the former Soviet Union at the time, that was absolutely incompatible, like with an image of a professor. And that made such a kind of, lasting impression on me. And I'm like, oh my God, like the world can be so different in principle. And I also wanted to note his amazing humanity and his kindness. And even though I did not end up working with Roger Kasperson, right? But I did do kind of some work with him at Sended for a little bit. And then also had a conversation probably about 10 years ago, somewhere at the AG with him. And he remembered every single thing. He asked about all things that could matter, to an academic, to somebody who came out from Clark University. And that was just absolutely gratifying and amazing. So,
I think that is a perfect spot to end. I don't want to keep you here too much longer, so thank you so much. Thank you for sharing, and we'll see you throughout the day.